Let me tell you something about Drake that nobody in the industry wants to say out loud. While you were out here calling this man a culture icon, posting his lyrics in your bio, bumping his albums on repeat, defending him in every beef, he was quietly, methodically, and legally taking everything from the artists around him. And not just taking it, he was getting them to hand it over with a smile on their face. No cap. We're talking Grammy nominations turned into nothing. We're talking artists who slept in studio tents to help build his albums, no hotel, no per diem, just sleeping bags on the floor and got next to zero promotion in return. We're talking about a man who hopped on your song, made it a number 12 Billboard hit, signed you to his label, then within 18 months left you so abandoned that you eventually ended up working a shift at a restaurant while the internet laughed at you. And here's the thing that will really mess you up. Nobody held a gun to anybody's head. That's what makes this the coldest finesse in hip-hop history. Drake didn't rob these people in an alley. He robbed them in a boardroom with contract language, with label politics, with cosigns that came with invisible chains attached. He robbed them with a handshake and a smile and a feature verse. $11 million, $10 million, Grammy nominations, masters, publishing rights, whole careers, gone. And Drizzy kept his masters, kept his publishing, kept the lights on in every building he walked out of, and kept counting. By the time you understand what happened to the people around him, it's already too late, just like the album said. So today we're breaking this down piece by piece. Every artist, every deal, every lawsuit, every diss, every restaurant apron. Because the story of how Drake finessed the people closest to him is one of the most ruthless business moves in the history of this music industry. And it's all documented, all factual, all public record. Stay with me, because this is gonna get real uncomfortable, real fast. Now, before we get into the individual bodies, and there are bodies, let me set the table so you understand exactly why this story hits different from your average label drama. Drake is not some regular rapper who had a bad deal and got lucky. This man engineered one of the most airtight business structures in modern hip-hop, while Lil Wayne was fighting Birdman for $51 million in court, while Tyga was crying about a conflicted lawyer who worked for both sides, while the hot boys were getting chewed up and spat out by Cash Money's financial chaos. Drake was sitting there in the same ecosystem and somehow walking away cleaner than everybody. That is not an accident, that is a blueprint. And the blueprint required other people to be the sacrifice. That's the part nobody talks about. Every time Drake made a smart deal, somewhere behind that deal was an artist who got a dumb one. Every time Drake protected his masters, there was somebody else who gave theirs away for access. Every time Drake kept the lights on at Cash Money, and he literally rapped about keeping the lights on, that light was being paid for with somebody else's ceiling. The OVO label was supposed to be the promised land for Canadian talent, the new Rockefeller, the new Young Money, the place where you got put on and actually stayed on. But here's what really went down behind the glossy owl logo and the Toronto wave. Artists gave Drake their best songs, their best years, their publishing, their leverage, and most of them got used up and discarded like they were never there. To understand how all of this really went down, we gotta go back to the very beginning, back to when Drake was just a kid from Degrassi trying to find a home. Because the way he learned to move in the industry, he learned it from watching other people get robbed. And instead of fighting it, he mastered it. Let's rewind to 2006. Drake is nobody, not globally, not even in Canada really. He's Jimmy from Degrassi, the wheelchair kid, trying to convince the rap industry that he's the real deal. He's dropping mixtapes under the name October's Very Own through a little imprint called All Things Fresh. No label, no money, no machine behind him, but he's hungry in a way that most people aren't. And the hunger isn't just for fame, it's for control. Even back then, the people around Drake said he was obsessed with ownership, obsessed with not being the guy who gets played. And why wouldn't he be? Look at what he was watching in real time. Cash Money Records had been one of the most dominant labels in hip-hop since the late 90s. Birdman and his brother Slim built that label from the ground up in New Orleans, signed a 15-year-old Lil Wayne, and created one of the most culturally significant imprints in rap history. But there was blood underneath every hit record they made. The Hot Boys, BG, Juvenile, Turk, and a teenage Lil Wayne helped build Cash Money into a national brand. And when it was time to get paid fairly, they got pushed out. Manny Fresh, the producer who literally invented the Cash Money sound, the man responsible for the sonic identity of that entire label, gone. Driven away by financial mismanagement, broken promises, and contracts that kept the artists locked in while the label kept the check. Drake saw all of that. He was watching it unfold in real time as he was trying to get in the door. Now, the first person who actually opened that door for Drake was a man named Jazz Prince. Jazz is the son of James Prince, the legendary Rap-A-Lot Records founder. In 2008, Jazz signed Drake to his management company, Aspire Music Group. Jazz was the one grinding for Drake before Drake was Drake. He's the one who got the bidding war going. He's the one who was in rooms making the case that this kid from Toronto was worth investing in. And in 2009, after a significant industry bidding war, it happened. Drake signed to the joint venture, Aspire Music Group, Young Money Entertainment, and Cash Money Records, distributed through Universal. The deal was done. Drake was in. Now here's where the finesse starts, and most people miss it because they're focused on the wrong thing. While everyone else who signed to Cash Money handed over their masters, handed over their publishing, handed over their creative control, Drake negotiated something completely different. And when I say negotiated, I mean his team fought tooth and nail for a deal that no other artist on that label had. Drake retained the publishing rights to his songs. He only paid 25% of his music sales revenues to the label as a distribution fee. He wasn't signed to Cash Money the way Wayne was signed to Cash Money. He essentially hired Cash Money to distribute his music. The labels didn't own his masters. They didn't own his catalog. They didn't control his career. Let that sink in for a second. Wayne, the man who brought Drake into Young Money, was still legally enslaved to a contract he signed as a teenager that gave Birdman control over his entire life's work. Meanwhile, Drake walked into the same ecosystem and negotiated a deal where the label worked for him, not the other way around. That's the blueprint. That's the foundation of everything that comes after. And the people around Drake? Most of them never got that foundation. They got the promise of the foundation, but the actual floor was pulled out from underneath them before they could even stand on it. And this is where things started getting real ugly. The Jazz Prince situation. The man who built the door got locked outside of it. Let's start with Jazz Prince because his story is the one that sets the tone for everything else. Jazz Prince discovered Drake. Not in the casual, I heard him on the radio way. In the foundational, I bet my professional reputation on this man before anyone else did way. Aspire Music Group's deal when Drake got signed in 2009 gave Jazz a portion of the Aspire cut of Drake's earnings, just over 1/5 of Aspire's share, plus an additional 5% of the total. That was the agreement. That was what Jazz was owed for finding, developing, and delivering one of the most commercially dominant artists of his generation. But here's what really went down. In late 2011, Drake fired his managers, Bryant and Robertson. And with that firing, everything that was supposed to flow to Jazz Prince through Aspire went sideways. The financial accounting stopped making sense. The money that was contractually owed started disappearing into the machinery of Cash Money's financial chaos. And Jazz Prince did what any businessman whose contract is being violated would do. He lawyered up. He sued. He added Young Money to the list of defendants. He spent years in litigation fighting for what he was contractually promised. The case settled in 2016. $11 million. Now here's what I need you to understand about that number. $11 million is not a small claims court situation. $11 million is not a misunderstanding. $11 million is what happens when somebody who discovered you, believed in you, and opened every door for you gets systematically cut out of the money they were promised once you no longer need them. The man who found Drake got $11 million in a settlement because the machine that Drake was at the center of stopped paying him what he was owed. And Drake, for his part, just kept making hits, kept breaking records, kept getting richer. Jazz Prince had to go to court to collect. That is a finesse. A clean, legal, documented finesse. Cash Money's implosion, and how Drake walked out unscathed. Now, while the Jazz Prince situation was playing out in the background, the entire Cash Money ecosystem was simultaneously imploding. And Drake's behavior during that implosion tells you everything you need to know about who he really is when the money gets tight. By 2015, Lil Wayne, the man who brought Drake into this industry, who co-signed him, who made Young Money the platform that launched Drake's career, was suing Birdman and Cash Money for $51 million. Wayne alleged that Cash Money had breached their contract, failed to release his albums, and was withholding massive amounts of money that Wayne had rightfully earned. These weren't small claims. This was the biggest artist vs. label dispute in hip-hop history at the time. Wayne was essentially being held hostage by a contract he'd signed when he was a child, while the music he'd created was sitting in a vault and the money he'd earned was allegedly being mismanaged and siphoned off. And Drake? Drake was watching all of this happen in real time. He was publicly expressing support for Wayne. In interviews, in lyrics, in on-stage moments where Wayne would shout, "Fuck Cash Money," and Drake would stand right next to him, Drake was in that moment right alongside Wayne, expressing solidarity. But here's what's interesting. Drake never burned Birdman the way Wayne did. He never took the full confrontational stance. He kept it subliminal. He kept it business. He made coded references in his music. "I keep the fucking lights on in the building. Man, my record deal should be 500 million," but he never blew the whole thing up publicly. You know why? Because Drake had already structured his deal so that Birdman couldn't hold him the way he was holding Wayne. Drake didn't need to sue for $51 million because he'd negotiated a deal where he kept his masters from jump. He didn't need to go to war publicly because his exit was already built into his contract. Wayne bled for years. Wayne's career was interrupted. Wayne's mental health was documented publicly, and it was in pieces. Wayne was going through one of the most devastating periods of his life while his music sat unreleased and his money was allegedly being stolen. Drake quietly made his last album for the label, dropped Scorpion in 2018, rapped "Soon as the album dropped, I'm out of the deal" on a track called "Is There More?" And he was out, clean. Catalog protected, masters intact, future secured. That's not just business, that's a masterclass in knowing exactly how to use a situation and then walking away before the building burns down, while the man who built you a platform was still trapped inside. Tyga, signed young, lawyered wrong, sued for everything. Now let's talk about Tyga, because Tyga's situation is the most straightforward example of what the young money cash money machine did to people who didn't have the leverage Drake had. Tyga was 17 years old when he signed to Cash Money, the same label ecosystem that was distributing Young Money, which was Drake's lane. He was a teenager, a kid, and when they handed him a contract, they also handed him a lawyer. But here's the catch. That lawyer also represented Cash Money Records. The same lawyer who was supposed to be protecting Tyga's interests was simultaneously working for the label that was on the other side of the negotiating table. That is textbook conflict of interest. That is one of the most basic violations of legal ethics and contract law. And it was done to a 17-year-old who didn't have the resources or the knowledge to know he was being set up before the ink even dried. Tyga would go on to have legitimate mainstream hits, Rack City, Faded, features everywhere, and he sued for $10 million, alleging that Cash Money's financial misconduct had robbed him of what he'd rightfully earned. Now, Drake didn't personally do this to Tyga, but Drake was the financial engine of the entire ecosystem. Drake's success was what kept Cash Money able to sign and develop artists like Tyga. And while Tyga was getting violated by a conflicted lawyer and a predatory contract, Drake was sitting in that same house with a deal that protected him. One man's deal was built to exploit him. The other man's deal was built to free him. They were in the same building. The difference was leverage, knowledge, and team quality. Drake had all three. Tyga had none. That's the finesse, not always direct. Sometimes it's just knowing how to position yourself in a system where everybody else is getting eaten alive. Party Next Door, the hitmaker who gave away his best songs. Now we get to OVO Sound, Drake's own label, the label he controlled, the label where the finesse becomes most personal, most intimate, and most revealing about how Drake actually moves. Party Next Door, real name Jerron Brathwaite from Mississauga, Ontario, was one of the most gifted songwriters in his generation before most people had ever heard of him. Before OVO, before Drake, he already had a publishing deal with Warner Chappell as a teenager. He had written hits, he had heat, he had a lane. Then Drake and OVO came calling, and the pitch was perfect. According to P&D himself, he was told, "Release your music when you want, have complete control, do your own thing. Complete creative freedom, no label politics, no corporate interference, just music." So he signed. And then something happened that tells you everything about how OVO Sound actually operates beneath the surface. P&D had a song called Wednesday Night Interlude. It was his song, written by him, for him, about his life. The plan was for it to appear on his project. And then Drake, his boss, his label head, his big bro, asked him for it. And Party gave it to him. It ended up on Drake's mixtape, If You're Reading This, It's Too Late, which debuted at #1 and went on to become one of the most celebrated projects of Drake's career. And Wednesday Night Interlude was one of the most emotionally resonant moments on the whole tape. It has only P&D's vocals. It sounds exactly like a Party Next Door song because it is a Party Next Door song. PND acknowledged publicly in a Rolling Stone interview that deep down he wished he'd kept it for himself. He said Drake allowed him to appear on the project, which gave him exposure. He framed it as a positive. He praised Drake for the gesture. But let's be real for a second. Your label boss asked for your best song. You're his artist. What are you really gonna say? No? Are you gonna tell the man who controls your distribution, your promotion, your placement, your career trajectory? Are you gonna tell him no? Of course not. And that right there is the finesse. It doesn't require a gun. It requires a power imbalance so large that saying no never actually feels like an option. PND handed over one of his greatest potential solo moments, and it became a defining moment on Drake's album. Meanwhile, PND's solo albums were coming out to solid reviews and some streaming numbers, but he was never fully broken as a standalone commercial force, not with that kind of song in his catalog instead of his own. You want more? PND wrote songs across 3 of Drake's projects. He helped produce significant portions of If You're Reading This, It's Too Late. He co-wrote Work for Rihanna, one of the biggest records of the decade. But that song's association in pop culture is more with Rihanna and the Jamaican wave than with PND's artistry. He built the sonic blueprint for an era of Drake's music, and his highest solo charting single as a lead artist in his home country of Canada peaked at number 56. The man who helped define the sound of the most commercially successful Canadian artist in history couldn't crack the top 50 in Canada as a solo act. You tell me if that's a coincidence. Majid Jordan slept in tents, got almost nothing in return. Majid Jordan, Daniel Daly, and 1985 are probably the most quietly heartbreaking story in the entire OVO catalog. These 2 guys from Toronto sacrificed in ways that most people will never know about. When Drake was making Nothing Was the Same, his 3rd studio album, the one with Hold On We're Going Home, the one that debuted at number 1 in 6 countries and sold over 1 million copies in America alone, Majid Jordan was in that studio every single day. And not in a comfortable studio with hotel rooms and catering and label budgets. They were sleeping in tents in the studio while they were writing and recording for Drake's album. Let me be completely clear about what that means. These were 2 young artists who were helping construct the sonic architecture of one of the most commercially successful albums of 2013. They were giving their time, their talent, their energy, their ideas, sleeping on the studio floor essentially, to help Drake build something historic. And they were signed to OVO Sound. They were supposed to be the next wave. Their OVO debut EP, A Place Like This, came out in 2014, and it got limited promotion, limited push, limited real label muscle behind it. The same label that used their sound to build a number 1 album couldn't seem to find the resources to break them as standalone artists. Drake has long been criticized for not properly promoting artists signed to OVO Sound during its years with Warner. Majid Jordan is the most painful example of that criticism because the receipts are right there. The tent sleeping, the album contribution, the follow-up treatment, you do the math. But if you want to talk about the single most devastating example of what can happen to an artist who gets picked up by Drake, used for their wave and then abandoned, there is no story more complete, more documented, and more heartbreaking than what happened to iLoveMakonnen. And I need you to really pay attention to this one, because this goes beyond music industry politics. This is about a human being whose entire trajectory got altered, and then, years later, ended up the punchline of an internet joke for working a restaurant shift. Let's go back to 2014. Makonnen Sharon, born April 12, 1989, raised in a multicultural household in South Los Angeles, moved to Atlanta, deeply creative, deeply individual, had been making music independently for years. He was a blogger before he was a rapper. He was documenting underground scenes, interviewing artists on MySpace, building community before he had a chart position. He wasn't a product, he was an artist, in the purest sense of the word. And then he made Club Going Up on a Tuesday. The song was a regional hit first. It had momentum before Drake ever touched it. Celebrities were posting about it. The internet was picking it up. It had a dreamy, melancholic, almost cartoon-like quality to it. Makonnen's voice was completely unlike anything else in hip-hop at the time. He wasn't rapping in the conventional sense. He was singing in this high, melodic, emotionally raw style that felt like a combination of an opera singer and a trap architect. It was genuinely innovative. And then Drake hopped on the remix. Drake remixed Tuesday and renamed it, and the song went from regional heat to national explosion. It hit number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100. It earned a Grammy nomination for Best Rap/Sung Collaboration. one of the most prestigious recognitions in the genre. Within months, iLoveMakonnen had a deal with OVO Sound, distributed through Warner Brothers Records. The dream had arrived, but here's what was actually going on beneath the surface of this dream, and I need you to hear this carefully. By Makonnen's own account, he only met Drake 3 times. 3 times. He spoke to him maybe 5 times total. And during those rare conversations, they never discussed Makonnen's career. They never talked about where his music was going, what kind of artist he wanted to become, what his vision was for his sound. The conversations were purely logistical, getting stuff done, clearing samples, moving product, never about Makonnen as a human being with artistic goals. To think about that. You are signed to a man's label. Your career is now dependent on that label's promotion, their resources, their industry relationships, and the man who runs that label has spoken to you 5 times and never once discussed your career. And the OVO machine confirmed this neglect with its actions. When Makonnen released his second EP in November 2015, OVO didn't post about it, didn't tweet about it, didn't push it, didn't put their cosign energy behind it in any meaningful way. For an artist on the label, that silence was deafening. In an industry where cosigns and label promotion are currency, being ignored by the man whose name is literally above yours on the contract is a death sentence. But it gets more complicated, because around this same time, old tweets surfaced. Tweets from 2010, when Makonnen was young, anonymous, and posting online just to get a reaction, the way teenagers do, that contained criticisms of Drake, called him corny, dissed his music. These tweets were from years before they ever had a relationship, years before Drake even knew Makonnen existed. But someone found them, and someone made sure Drake knew about them. Makonnen has said that's when things really went sideways. That's when what little communication existed between him and Drake effectively went to zero. His second EP came out, OVO went silent, and Makonnen, who had apologized publicly for the tweets, who understood they were old and dumb and youthful stupidity, was left completely out in the cold. Now let's talk about what the OVO Association was doing to Makonnen's industry relationships beyond his own label, because this part is crucial to understanding the full scope of the finesse. Makonnen has said directly that once people in the industry knew he was with OVO, his network got restricted. Artists who might have worked with him were keeping distance because they didn't know what the relationship between him and Drake was. The Weeknd, who had his own complicated history with Drake, saw Makonnen in passing, and the vibe was awkward because of the assumption that Makonnen was a Drake ally. People were calling him Drake's new toy, a phrase that got under Makonnen's skin because he didn't sign up to be a toy. He signed up to be an artist. The OVO cosign that should have been a launch pad had become a cage. He couldn't move freely. He couldn't collaborate freely. He couldn't build independent industry relationships because his affiliation came with invisible politics that nobody explained to him before he signed. By April 2016, it was over. Makonnen announced he was leaving OVO Sound. His statement was gracious, thanking Drake and 40 and Oliver, calling it a business decision, saying, "Sorry, there's no beef to report." Professional, measured, but the reality behind the statement was that he'd been shelved, ignored, and used for the wave that Tuesday created. And once that wave served its purpose for OVO's brand, the label had quietly moved on. And here's the most brutal part of the aftermath. The years after OVO were not kind. Makonnen released music independently. He came out publicly as gay in 2017, a genuinely brave act in hip-hop, and rather than receiving the support an act like that deserves, the industry largely treated it as another reason to dismiss him. He kept making music. In 2024 alone, he dropped 2 projects. Nobody picked up on them. The blogs didn't cover them. The streaming numbers weren't there. He posted a retirement announcement on Instagram. The retirement post got more coverage than the actual music. And then the TikTok clip dropped. A video surfaced of iLoveMakonnen working in a restaurant. Not performing, not recording, working. A man who had a Grammy nomination, a number 12 Billboard hit, an OVO Sound deal, seen in a restaurant, serving food, doing what countless honest, hard-working people do every single day. And instead of being treated with dignity, the internet mocked him, Chef Makonnen. The Joe Budden podcast talked about it. Social media ran with it. Thousands of people who had never built anything in their lives laughed at a man who had genuinely created something, who had a sound so distinctive that Drake himself remixed it, for choosing to earn an honest living. Makonnen clapped back. He pointed out the hypocrisy. He said he had released music and people ignored it. But let him post a retirement notice or let someone catch him working a job and suddenly everyone has an opinion. And he's right. That's the cruelest part of the whole story. This industry, and the audience that consumes it, will celebrate you when you're hot, use you while you're useful, ignore you when you're building, and then laugh at you when you're surviving. And the label that was supposed to protect him from that cycle was the first one to leave him exposed to it. Makonnen told it plainly. They knew that I had a new wave, a new sound starting up, and they jumped on that to further their wave. They didn't want to sustain and support me, only themselves. Grammy to restaurant in under a decade, and the man who ran the label that signed him is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. No cap. That's the coldest finesse in this entire story. Now let's look at what the courts and the public record actually tell us about the full scope of this, because when you lay all of it out in one place, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In 2016, the Jazz Prince lawsuit settled for $11 million. $11 million paid out because Drake's management transition in 2011 derailed the financial obligations that were owed to the man who discovered him. The settlement was quiet, no press conference, no public acknowledgement, just money moving from one account to another to make the legal problem disappear. And Drake kept touring, kept releasing albums, kept breaking records. Lil Wayne settled his lawsuit against Birdman and Cash Money in 2018. The terms reportedly included Wayne being compensated over $10 million for previously failed payments, and Young Money's ownership being transferred from Cash Money to Universal directly. Birdman's 49% ownership of Young Money was transferred to Wayne. It took years of litigation, public feuding, emotional damage, and career disruption for Wayne to get what should have been his from the beginning. Drake again walked away from that same ecosystem without the scars. His pre-2018 catalog, all the albums he made for Young Money and Cash Money, is now owned by Universal Music Group as part of the $100 million settlement Wayne made with Republic Records in 2020. Wayne sold the entire Young Money catalog, including Drake's and Nicki Minaj's, to settle. Which means that while Drake has his own catalog and masters protected post-2018, the earlier part of his legacy is technically controlled by Universal through that settlement. The long-term implications of that are still playing out. Tyga's lawsuit against Cash Money, $10 million, speaks for itself. A 17-year-old who got handed a lawyer by the label he was signing with, a conflict of interest so blatant it should have been illegal from jump. Tyga had real commercial success, real hit records, and he still ended up in a lawsuit trying to claw back what was rightfully his from a label that had its tentacles in both sides of his contract. OVO Sound's own trajectory after Drake's moment of peak dominance tells the story of what happened to the artists left behind. The label moved from Warner to independent status in 2022, then into a distribution partnership with Santa Ana Label Group, a Sony Music subsidiary, in 2024. Through all of those transitions, the artists on the roster, Party Next Door, Majid Jordan, Roy Woods, DVSN, are still largely trying to break through as major standalone acts. The most commercially successful artist on OVO Sound by most measures is still Drake himself. The label he built to launch careers primarily launched his, again. And the legal and business documentation around iLoveMakonnen's situation, while not ending in a lawsuit, tells its own story. Makonnen has been explicit in interviews about what happened. OVO didn't post his second EP. He was effectively shelved. The label that signed him to capitalize on the Tuesday wave stopped supporting him the moment that wave was no longer useful to their brand. He said it clearly in multiple interviews across multiple platforms, and no one from OVO has publicly disputed the characterization. The pattern, when you lay it out, is consistent. Discover the artist when they have heat. Capture the heat through a feature, a remix, a co-sign, or a signing. Benefit from their creativity, their sound, their cultural wave, and then, when the wave has served its purpose, quietly move on. Not with a confrontation, not with a press statement, just with silence. Unanswered emails, no posts, no promotion, no collaboration, just the slow disappearance of institutional support, leaving the artist to figure out on their own that the machine has already moved on to the next thing. That's not illegal, that's the music industry. But the fact that it keeps happening around Drake specifically, in his label, with artists he signed, with people who helped build his catalog, suggests it's not accidental. So what does all of this mean? What do we actually take from this story? Let me give it to you straight, because this is where most videos get preachy and start moralizing, and that's not what we're here for. We're here for the truth. The first truth is this: Drake is not a villain in a movie. He is not twirling a mustache somewhere in the OVO mansion laughing at the artists he's outmaneuvered. What he is, and this is what makes the story genuinely complicated, is one of the most sophisticated businessmen hip-hop has ever produced, operating inside a system that was built to exploit artists and choosing to master that system instead of being victimized by it. He watched Wayne get exploited. He watched Juvenile get exploited. He watched Manny Fresh get driven out. He watched Makonnen get hyped and then discarded by an industry that has zero loyalty to its artists once the heat cools. And he said, consciously or not, I am not going to be that person. I am going to own my masters. I am going to control my publishing. I am going to negotiate from a position of leverage. I am going to be the label boss, not the artist who gets shelved. But to do that, to protect yourself completely inside a system like this, the people around you tend to absorb the cost. Jazz Prince absorbed it to the tune of $11 million in a lawsuit. iLoveMakonnen absorbed it with his career. Majid Jordan absorbed it with their years. Party Next Door absorbed it with his best song. The second truth is about the music industry itself. This is not unique to Drake. This is what labels do. This is what has always been done. Cash Money did it. Def Jam did it. Interscope did it. Every major label in the history of recorded music has a graveyard of artists who were signed, used, shelved, and discarded. The system was designed to extract value from creative people who don't understand contract law and don't have the resources to fight back. Drake didn't invent that system, he just happened to navigate it better than everyone around him. But navigating a corrupt system so skillfully that you become its primary beneficiary while everyone around you gets eaten, that is its own kind of moral weight. Even if it's all legal, even if it's all business, even if nobody pulled a trigger. The third truth is about what this tells us for the future. The next artist who gets offered a deal by a superstar's label, whether it's OVO Sound or any other imprint, needs to read this story and ask some hard questions before they sign. Questions like, who owns my masters? Who controls my publishing? Do I have a lawyer who works only for me, not for the label? What are the actual promotional commitments in this contract? And most importantly, what happens if my wave passes? What does this label owe me when I'm not hot? Because the glamour of the cosign is real. When Drake says your name, the world listens. When OVO posts your single, streaming numbers move. When Drake brings you out on stage, you are instantly credible to an audience of millions. That power is real and it has real value. But that value has a price. And sometimes the price is your best songs. Sometimes it's your industry freedom. Sometimes it's your entire trajectory. And sometimes, in the most extreme cases, it's all of those things at once. And you end up a decade later working a restaurant shift while the internet laughs and the man who signed you is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. iLoveMakonnen didn't fall off because he was untalented. Tuesday is still being played. The dreamy, singular voice that made that song work hasn't gone anywhere. He fell off because the industry support structure that should have been built around him, the label, the promotion, the networking, the sustained push, was stripped away at the exact moment when he needed it most. He was used for his wave and released when the wave broke. Majid Jordan didn't lose their creative gifts. They're still making music, but sleeping in tents to help build a #1 album and then getting limited promotional support in return, that is a transaction that reveals where the priorities of the institution actually lie. Party Next Door is arguably the most commercially successful OVO artist outside of Drake himself. And that's precisely because he's the one who kept his head down, kept giving Drake what he needed, and waited long enough for the label to eventually invest more in him. But even he admitted in quiet moments in interviews that he wished he'd kept Wednesday Night Interlude. That one small admission tells you everything. And Jazz Prince, the man who found Drake, who opened the first door, who put his credibility on the line when nobody else was willing to, had to sue in court for $11 million to collect what he was promised. The numbers don't lie, the lawsuits don't lie, the court documents don't lie, the TikTok videos of Grammy-nominated artists working restaurant shifts don't lie. This is the story of how the music industry works when you are not the one in control. And it is the story of what Drake built by making absolutely certain, from the very first contract he ever signed, that he would always be the one in control, not the artist at the mercy of the label. The label. Not the one who gets finessed, the one who does the finessing. And every single artist in this story, Jazz Prince, Tyga, Makonnen, PND, Majid Jordan, they all paid tuition to the same school. Some of them paid $11 million. Some of them paid with their careers. Some of them paid with the best song they ever wrote. And Drake took the lesson, invested it, and became exactly the thing that the music industry had been training every artist before him to fear. That is the legacy, and depending on where you stand, as a fan, as an artist, as a business student, as a human being, you can decide for yourself whether to call it genius or something else entirely. But you cannot call it an accident, because nothing about Drake is ever an accident.